Have you ever wondered why someone who acts so strong, so independent, and so emotionally distant suddenly changes after silence enters their life? Why does the person who once seemed untouched by emotions begin to feel something when nothing is being said at all? This is where the truth about no contact begins, not the romantic version people talk about online, not the dramatic version filled with assumptions and revenge thinking, but the real psychological experience that happens inside an avoidant mind when connection is removed and silence takes over. Because no contact is not just about two people stopping communication. It is about what happens inside a person who was trained to survive through emotional distance. And for avoidant personalities, silence is not empty. It is loud in a way most people never understand. At first, no contact feels like freedom, like control returning, like emotional pressure finally disappearing. The avoidant mind relaxes almost instantly. There is no more expectation to respond, no more emotional demand to process, no more vulnerability required in the moment. And in that first phase, everything feels stable again. But here is what most people misunderstand. The avoidant nervous system is not built for emotional closeness, but it is also not designed for complete emotional emptiness. It adapts through suppression, not elimination. So when no contact begins, it does not remove emotion. It only removes stimulation. And when stimulation disappears, the mind enters a quieter state where suppressed emotions slowly begin to surface beneath the surface of awareness. Not loudly, not clearly, but subtly, in ways that are easy to ignore at first. This is why the beginning of no contact is so deceptive. On the outside, everything looks fine. The avoidant continues life normally. They may even appear happier, more focused, more detached. But psychology tells a different story underneath. Because the human brain does not process emotional disconnection as nothing happened. It processes it as loss of attachment input. And whenever attachment input is removed, the mind does not stay still for long. It starts to adjust, it starts to scan, it starts to fill gaps, even if the person believes they do not care. Now here is where the deeper psychological conflict begins. Avoidant individuals are often shaped by early experiences where emotional closeness felt overwhelming, unsafe, or unpredictable. So they learned a powerful survival strategy: disconnect before being hurt. This strategy works in the short term. It creates emotional control. It creates distance. It creates the illusion of strength. But no contact removes the very thing that keeps this strategy stable: distraction through interaction. And when interaction disappears, the mind is left alone with itself. That is where the silent battle begins. Not between two people, but between two internal systems. One system says, stay calm, stay detached, stay in control. The other system begins to feel something more human, more vulnerable, more unfiltered. And this second system does not speak in words at first. It speaks in discomfort. A strange emptiness, a subtle irritation, a sense that something is off, even when everything looks normal on the surface. This is the moment where no contact stops being just a situation and becomes a psychological mirror. Because silence does something powerful to avoidant individuals. It removes external validation. It removes emotional engagement. It removes the structure that keeps inner feelings buried. And when that structure disappears, the mind has no choice but to face itself in fragments. This is why the beginning stage of no contact is so important to understand. It is not about who misses who first. It is not about who has more control. It is about how the brain reacts when emotional dependency patterns are suddenly interrupted. An interruption always creates adjustment. Sometimes that adjustment looks like peace, sometimes it looks like relief, but deep down, it is the beginning of internal recalibration. Because the avoidant mind is now entering a space where it cannot fully escape its own emotional architecture, and whether they realize it or not, something has already started shifting. A process has begun that cannot be reversed just by staying busy or pretending nothing matters. This is the silent beginning most people never see, and it sets the foundation for everything that comes next in this journey. But before understanding what happens later, you need to understand this first truth clearly. No contact does not immediately create clarity for an avoidant. It creates silence. And silence is where the mind starts revealing what distraction used to hide. If you keep watching, you will begin to understand exactly how this silent process evolves into deeper emotional stages, how ego, memory, and hidden attachment patterns slowly surface, and why the avoidant experience is far more complex than simple indifference. Because what comes next is not predictable, and it is not as emotionally distant as it first appears. What most people fail to understand is that no contact is not simply a decision between two individuals. It is not just blocking, ignoring, or walking away. It is a psychological shift that changes how the mind processes attachment, identity, and emotional regulation. For an avoidant person, this shift is even deeper, because their emotional system does not operate in a balanced way when it comes to closeness. It operates through control, distance, and self-protection. So when contact is removed, the mind does not experience it as a neutral event. It experiences it as a disruption in internal stability. To understand this properly, you need to see it from inside their mental structure. Avoidant individuals often build their sense of safety around predictability, not emotional intimacy, but predictability of space, knowing when to engage, when to withdraw, and when to shut things off completely. This rhythm becomes familiar over time, almost automatic. It creates the feeling of being in control even when emotions are present beneath the surface. But no contact removes this rhythm completely. There is no message arriving at a certain time. There is no emotional trigger from another person that requires response. There is no opportunity to manage distance through interaction. And when that structure disappears, the brain is forced into an unfamiliar state where it cannot rely on its usual coping patterns. This is where psychological discomfort begins to form in subtle ways. Not as panic, not as visible distress, but as internal imbalance. The mind starts adjusting its internal expectations. It tries to normalize the absence of interaction. It builds temporary explanations to restore calmness. Thoughts like, "this is better," or "this is what I needed," appear automatically. These thoughts are not necessarily lies. They are protective interpretations created to reduce emotional uncertainty, because the human mind dislikes unresolved emotional gaps, especially a mind that is trained to avoid vulnerability. So instead of processing emotional loss directly, the avoidance system often converts it into logic. It reframes the situation as independence, necessity, or personal space. This is not a conscious manipulation. It is a defense mechanism that keeps emotional intensity under control. But beneath these rational thoughts, another process quietly continues. The attachment system does not shut down simply because logic takes over. It continues to monitor emotional significance in the background. It tracks absence. It registers change. It notices disruption in familiar emotional patterns. And even if the person feels unaffected, the brain still records the shift. This creates a unique internal conflict. On one side, there is a conscious identity that insists on independence. On the other side, there is an unconscious system that still reacts to emotional separation. These two layers do not communicate directly, but they influence each other constantly. This is why no contact can feel strangely complex for avoidant individuals, not because they are confused on the surface, but because different parts of their mind are processing different realities at the same time. One part is maintaining distance. Another part is quietly adapting to absence. Over time, the mind begins to stabilize again, but not in the way most people assume. Stability does not mean emotional neutrality. It means adaptation to a new normal. The brain learns to function without external emotional input from the previous connection. It reduces sensitivity to reminders and builds new routines that do not depend on interaction. This is where emotional suppression becomes more refined. Instead of actively pushing feelings away, the mind simply stops engaging with them. Thoughts related to the past connection are not fully processed or resolved. They are stored in background memory, accessed only in brief moments when triggered by association. This is why avoidant individuals can appear completely fine on the surface after separation. Their emotional system has not healed in the traditional sense. It has reorganized itself to function without immediate emotional engagement. But this reorganization comes with hidden cost, because unprocessed emotional material does not disappear. It remains stored, waiting for conditions that allow it to resurface, and no contact creates exactly those conditions. When external distractions reduce over time, the internal world becomes more noticeable. The mind has fewer external inputs to focus on, so it begins to scan internal memory more frequently. Small fragments of past emotional experiences begin to surface in unexpected ways, not as full memories, but as emotional impressions, a feeling without a clear source, a thought that appears briefly and disappears quickly, a sense of familiarity attached to something that should feel distant. These subtle signals are important because they show that the emotional system is still active underneath the surface of detachment. Another important aspect of no contact is how it affects self-perception. Avoidant individuals often build their identity around being self-sufficient. They see emotional independence as strength. So when separation occurs, they may reinforce this identity even more strongly to maintain internal consistency. However, identity reinforcement can create internal pressure, because the stronger the belief in independence becomes, the more the mind must ignore any contradictory emotional signals. This creates cognitive tension that is not always conscious, but still influential. The mind must constantly choose between maintaining an image of complete emotional control or acknowledging subtle internal reactions that do not fit that image. Most of the time, the image wins, but not without effort, and effort always creates internal strain. This is why no contact is not a simple emotional reset. It is a restructuring of how the brain organizes attachment, memory, and identity. It changes the way emotional information is stored and accessed. It creates layers of suppression, adaptation, and redefinition that operate quietly beneath conscious awareness. And while it may appear as if nothing significant is happening, the internal system is constantly adjusting in the background. Every day without contact reinforces new neural patterns. Every moment of absence strengthens detachment pathways. At the same time, every suppressed emotional signal remains stored, waiting for a trigger that can activate deeper reflection. This dual process is what makes the avoidant experience so layered. Nothing is fully gone, nothing is fully expressed. Everything exists in a state of controlled distance. And this is only the structural beginning of what no contact truly does to the avoidant mind. Because once this foundation is set, deeper psychological stages begin to unfold that are far less stable, far more emotionally charged, and far more revealing than what appears on the surface. When silence continues for longer than expected, something begins to change inside the avoidant mind that cannot be explained through logic alone. At first, the absence of contact felt like structure returning, like emotional pressure being removed. But as time extends, that same absence starts to feel different. It stops feeling like relief and starts becoming something quieter, harder to define, and more mentally active beneath the surface. This shift does not happen suddenly. It builds slowly through repetition of empty space. The brain is a prediction system. It learns patterns from repetition. When communication used to exist, even in inconsistent form, the mind adapted to expecting it. It adjusted its internal timing around possible interaction. So when that pattern is removed completely, the brain does not simply forget it. Instead, it keeps anticipating it for a while, even when there is no evidence left to support it. This creates a subtle internal loop. A moment of expectation forms, followed by realization of absence, followed by adjustment, and then again expectation. Over time, this loop weakens, but it does not disappear immediately. It gradually transforms into a background sense of waiting that the person may not consciously recognize. During this stage, distraction no longer works in the same way as before. Earlier, activity could fully occupy attention. Tasks, routines, and external engagement were enough to maintain emotional distance. But now, even during busy moments, the mind begins to drift inward without permission, not toward clear memories, but toward fragments of experience that feel emotionally incomplete. These fragments are not full thoughts. They are impressions tied to moments, conversations, or emotional intensity that was never fully processed. They appear briefly and then fade, but their emotional tone remains. This is where internal resistance begins to weaken slightly. The avoidance system is built to reduce emotional exposure. However, suppression is not permanent control. It requires continuous effort. And when time stretches long enough, that effort becomes less rigid. The mind starts conserving energy, which leads to reduced resistance against internal material. As a result, previously suppressed emotional content begins to surface more frequently, even if only in small doses. At the same time, another psychological layer becomes active: meaning reconstruction. The brain does not like unresolved emotional endings. It tries to create coherence out of incomplete experiences. So, in the absence of closure, it begins to reinterpret past events in a new way. Moments that once seemed insignificant may now carry different emotional weight. Situations that were previously dismissed may begin to feel more complex in hindsight. This process does not always lead to regret, it leads to reevaluation. And reevaluation is powerful because it destabilizes fixed emotional conclusions. Avoidant individuals often rely on clear internal conclusions to maintain stability. Once something is labeled as unimportant or unnecessary, it becomes easier to distance from it. But when the mind starts questioning those labels, internal certainty weakens. This does not immediately change behavior, but it changes perception. Perception is the foundation of emotional response. Another important change during this stage is the reactivation of emotional comparison. The mind begins to unconsciously compare current emotional state with past emotional experiences, not in a logical way, but in a feeling-based way. Moments of connection, even if previously minimized, may begin to feel different when contrasted with present emptiness. This comparison is not always pleasant. It is subtle, but it creates contrast awareness, and contrast awareness is one of the strongest triggers for emotional awakening. However, the avoidant system does not easily accept this shift. It tries to neutralize it by reinforcing independence narratives again. Thoughts that emphasize self-reliance become more frequent. The identity of being unaffected is reasserted internally as a form of stabilization. But now, this reinforcement carries more effort than before, because it is no longer supported by complete emotional silence. It is being challenged by internal signals that cannot be fully ignored. This creates a form of mental tension that stays beneath awareness. On the surface, everything appears controlled. Internally, there is constant adjustment happening between opposing interpretations of reality. Another significant development in this stage is the emergence of curiosity. Curiosity does not appear as emotional longing immediately. It appears as mental inquiry. The mind begins to wonder about outcomes, current states, and possibilities. Questions form without intention. There is no active search for answers, but there is passive awareness that something remains unresolved. This curiosity is important because it signals that emotional detachment is no longer absolute. It indicates that cognitive space is now available for reconsideration. And once reconsideration becomes possible, emotional distance is no longer fully stable. During this period, dreams, random thoughts, and associative triggers may increase. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle interruptions of mental flow. A song, a phrase, or a familiar scenario may briefly bring emotional tone back into awareness before it disappears again. These interruptions are not accidents. They are signs of memory integration, attempting to process what was previously segmented and stored separately. The avoidant mind often stores emotional experiences in isolated compartments. But isolation is not permanent. Over time, connections between these compartments begin to reform, allowing fragmented emotional material to interact again. This is why internal experiences become more dynamic during extended no contact. Nothing remains fully separated anymore. Everything starts to interact at a deeper level, and this interaction is what slowly shifts the internal state from pure detachment toward something more complex, not attachment yet, but the beginning of emotional reactivation beneath controlled identity. Even though external behavior may still reflect stability, the internal system is now far more active than before. The absence that once felt simple is now layered with interpretation, curiosity, and subtle emotional response. This is the stage where no contact stops being about absence alone. It becomes about what absence starts revealing within the mind itself. And as this process continues, the internal structure moves closer to deeper emotional confrontation that cannot be managed purely through avoidance strategies anymore.